Hi, my name is John, and this is Monday Checklist. In today's video, we'll be talking about how one great nation's plan to curb its growth in population has now severe ramifications, not just for their country, but also for the rest of the world. What do I mean? So we're talking about none other than the great country that is China, which is one of the biggest or the biggest population in the world currently, but that is in peril due to the lack of growth in their population, meaning the birth rate has declined significantly because of their one child policy, which is never a good idea to sustain it in the long period. Because as we've seen in other nations, other developed nations at that, you can look at Japan as another example, Canada is another example, US to a certain extent, even some European countries here. And this has dire consequence because obviously of its reliance on the manufacturing aspects, which is home to China. And obviously it's not just a business that's affected, but the society as a whole, which can be detrimental in the long run here. So which we'll be taking a look here. So according to businessinsider.com, the population, sorry, the according to insiders, I'm sorry. According to businessinsider.com, it mentions here that the great people shortage has now hit China in particular. So the country's shrinking population is a grim omen for the rest of the world, which, as I mentioned, can have severe ramification because of the global nature of many nations, many businesses that are interconnected. Just take a look at the shortage that occurred during the pandemic at that time. So let's take a closer look here. And it mentions specifically that China's population, despite having 1.4 billion people worldwide, uh, according to China's National Bureau of Statistics, announced that its population shrank in 2020 last year, falling roughly by 150,000 people. Now, obviously, 850,000 may not seem much, but if you look at it in a long term period, say years or decades or several decades down the line, then that would simply severely hamper the growth of any nation here. Now, obviously, if you did the math, let's say you have a couple that only has one child, so two adults, one children, and if that parent were to move on, you're left with one children, and if the children were to get married and has one, it narrows down your population significantly here. And obviously, not all couples tends to have kids, especially if it's being regulated by any government or entities in this case. And obviously there's a lot of factor that goes into, should one even have a family, what's the reason, is it economical, viable, and all of those nitty gritty stuff, which complicates matters if you're trying to encourage to stabilize your population here. Anyway, the shocking statistics, as mentioned, is only the start of China's population decline, which mentions that India is set to surpass China's population, which could be a good thing or a bad thing in the long run here. So what's happening here is people the United Nations mentions that has estimated that if China's birth rate remains at its super low level, the country fails to position itself as an attractive destination for migrants, which is again it's another issue altogether. The country will lose nearly half of its population by the end of this century. Think about that. From 1.4 billion of its total population will be reduced to just 700 million people for a vast nation that is China, as mentioned here. And obviously, a great nation relies on its young workforce to support its aging population. That's why a pyramid is an ideal position wherein majority of your vast population is the young demographic, and then the middle age, and then the oldest population is at its peak so that it can support it. But with what's happening here. And as I mentioned, in other developed nations, it has become an inverted pyramid where the majority of the population is now at the top rather than at the bottom here, which is not going to be sustainable in any stretch of the imagination here. Uh, it mentions here strong growth in its working age population over the past several decades allowed China to become the world's factory. Over 70% of solar panels, 60% of farm machines, and 25% of robots are constructed with components from Chinese suppliers. Because of its manufacturing prowess and importance to supply chain, China's shrinking working age population has numerous direct or indirect effects to the global economy. And obviously, it's an omen, as mentioned at the start of this discussion, of what things to come, not just in Asia, but as well as in Northern America, as well as in Europe as well. So, as mentioned, fewer children, fewer workers is a recipe for disaster waiting to happen here. And by then, if you're trying to stem the decline, and you don't try to avert it at an earlier stage, by then it's too late. And that's a recipe for extinction if you think of worst case scenario here. So let's take a look at the fertility rate here, as you can see here. So way back in the 1960s, before it instituted the one-child policy, it has a sharp decline over the next few decades, especially from the 60s all the way to the 90s. And now it has dipped below 2, which is not ideal. Obviously, for every parents, you need at least one or two minimum or more, and it should be encouraged because obviously, a lot of external factors that comes into play here. But if it's not encouraged, it's limited, then it's going to go down. And as you can see here, the decline from 6 to 2 was pretty precipitous, as you can see the decline. But over the next few decades, 90s all the way to 2000s, from average of 3, it dipped below 2. And if it dips below 1, then you see the worst case scenario here. And obviously, currently in the 2020s, as you can see, the decline is continuing, and it's not a good sign. And no matter amount of forecast here, as you can see, being optimistic is, can it curve the growth here? Because obviously, even if the government were to suddenly encourage by any means necessary, that's going to take years or even decades, several generations before that would stem the tide here, which is, I think by then it would be too late. But the question is, what is the government going to do or plan to encourage the growth of its population again? Anyway, so let's look at the population as how it's shrinking right now. So you can see this in this bell curve. The population has risen from a measly, close to 600 million before the 1960s, and it has reached its peak at 1.4 billion in 2020. And as you can see here, if it's reached its peaks, it can only, go down after that. And as you can see here, by the end of the 21st century, the population, if it left unchecked and could take longer, the population will decrease by the same amount when it started way back in the 1960s, which is obviously not a good sign for either the country and for other neighboring nations as well, who relies on the manufacturing capability of which is China here. Now it mentions here that unlike many developed economies in the West, China and other major economic powers in Asia aren't using migration to offset declining fertility. And obviously, that's one of the main solutions that, in particular, the United States and Canada is trying to use to increase its population. If the main populace, main people in the current countries are not procreating at a rate that is needed to sustain its population. But obviously, with the likes of China and even in Japan, very hesitant on absorbing immigrants from other nations for whatever the reason may be, has already crippled their chances of maintaining their population in the long period of time. Look at Japan. on its insistence to rely on technology to support their needs. But obviously, there are some things that you can automate. But for majority of needs, special caring needs for older people, for people in general, you need people, you know, you need people to deal with people, which is difficult to replace in this as case. And obviously, it was mentioned here that fewer children, fewer immigrants means fewer workers in the long run, which is a recipe for a disaster here. And until when, before the governments or any countries similar to China's situation here, they need to move quickly if they want to resolve the issue. Because I think in cases like in Japan, where in the rural areas there are plenty of ghost towns already, the government tried to incentivize by encouraging people to move back to the rural areas, but by then it's too late. By paying a low amount of money, or by paying people to move back to the rural side, which is obviously ideal for certain people, but not for the majority. And again, it goes back to the main fundamental reason why do people should have a family in the first place. But with the current times, how social media has affected the perception of reality, people are not as inclined to having a family for whatever the case may be, and that has hindered the growth of many nations here, in particular in China or in Japan as well here. Obviously, the time will only tell if they maintain this trajectory. It can only get worse before it gets better. If that sound makes any sense. And as you can see here, compared to other nations regarding forecasted working age population, China on the red line here, as you can see, is on a precipitous decline compared to other nations, which is, being able to hover at a respectable rate here. And with only India, which is able to stabilize its growth, but it's declining still, but superior to other nations. So from 900 million when it started way back in 2030s, all the way to the 21st century. If things hold, they're able to outlast many of the other nations here. And as you can see here, for nations such as Nigeria, Europe, US, and even Indonesia is struggling mightily. And you have Europe declining by as much as 200 million by the 21st century. And if you look closely here for the US, which utilized migration as one of the core principles to be able to stabilize its lack of people, and encouraging people in general having a family and everything to stabilize it. But still, 200 million is still a small population compared to other nations. And then if you look at Indonesia, has which somewhat has stabilized based on its projection, and with only Nigeria, looking more promising when it grows its population from a measly 100 million, a little over 100 million, to a little over 350 million by the end of the century here. But that's all projections here. But the concerning part is China's role effect in the global stage, which is obviously never ideal in any situation. And obviously you have to understand the root cause, how to change this trend, encourage people to get married and have kids, plenty of kids here. Obviously, support for family is important, education is important, subsidies for having multiple children would be ideal. And obviously having a strong foundation of a family, encouraging family in general would be ideal here. Hopefully it's not too late for China or for any other nations that's being affected with the steep decline of their population here. We'll see how this pans out. We're always optimistic here. Anyway, that's it for this week's Monday checklist. Come back again on Monday for more Monday checklist. As always, stay here at Business Focus. If you enjoy watching these types of content, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. You can consider sharing this content to other people who might find it enjoyable or interesting as well here. As always, I'll see you in the next one. Take care.